It is a great honor to welcome to the show Professor Peter Stansky. He is the Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University, and he's an author of a recent book titled The Socialist Patriot, George Orwell and War. Welcome to the show, Peter. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I should like to first begin by asking, how did Eric Arthur Blair become George Orwell?
Well, actually, I've been with a collaborator now more than 50 years ago, just 50 years ago, in 1972, we published a book called The Unknown Orwell, which very much tried to answer that question. And then a second book called Orwell, the Transformation. And the two books took Orwell up through the Spanish Civil War. And in fact, it's a long story, sort of unlocked the biographical logjam that had happened. But he created the first book. It was triggered by Sir Richard Rees, who was a great friend of Orwell's and Orwell's literary executor. And he said, in order to understand Orwell, you have to find out more about Eric Blair. You know, his real name was Eric Arthur Blair. He never legally changed his name. Somebody once said to him, maybe you should change your name to George Orwell. He said, yes, but then I would have to find another name to write under. He created George Orwell when he published his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London. And he sent his publisher, Victor Gollancz, three possible, H. Lewis Always, one other name, I've forgotten at the moment, and George Orwell. And he said, on the whole, I prefer George Orwell. George, of course, is a quintessential, it's St. George and so forth. King George, the Georges, it's a quintessential English name. And Orwell was the name of a river in Suffolk, I think, near where his parents were then living and where he was staying when he came back from Burma. And it's a hard question. I mean, somehow I think he felt he needed a persona that wasn't quite himself to write as. He didn't like, although as I say, he never changed his name, but Eric and Blair, I mean, Blair, of course, was a Scottish name, and he had mixed feelings about Scotland. But also, since the book Down and Out in Paris and London was about being a tramp in England and being a dishwasher in Paris, not very sort of poverty-stricken jobs, he felt the book might embarrass his parents. So that was one reason that he wanted to publish it under a pseudonym. And then in the books the novels that he published post the first book were all published as George Orwell, but actually some of the periodical pieces he wrote as Eric Blair, and some as George Orwell. But then after the Spanish Civil War, everything he wrote as George Orwell. And he would frequently, most of the people who he met after the Spanish Civil War would know him as George, and the people he met whom he knew from before the Spanish Civil War tended to know him as Eric. But also, of course, when he worked for the BBC during the Second World War, and then as an employee of the BBC, he was Eric Blair. He very, very rarely there's some letters and so forth where he would sign both names, but it tended to be people that he knew earlier. He might stay as Eric, but people that he knew later, he would be George. I think it just created a sort of persona who was the writer. But then there's in the simple country churchyard where he's buried. He's buried under the name of Eric Arthur Blair, and so that continued to be his legal name.
Mm-hmm. So when we think of the term Orwellian, which has made it into the English language, it refers to what was described in his great book, 1984. But there are other ways in which we can use a political thinker's name as an adjective, for example, Hegelian and Marxist, which describe a line of thought that's similar or based on these two thinkers. So if we are to use Orwellian in that sense, how would you describe it?
Well, I think there are two interpretations of Orwellian. The sort of dominant, and both are appropriate. There's the dominant negative interpretation, which I'll say something about. But first, there's the more positive, but which is rarely used, Orwellian, which I think can refer to his brilliance in his essays. Where he's able to, where his consciousness of language, the importance of language, clarity, using simple language, et cetera, et cetera. But the more dominant interpretation of Orwellian is negative, but not negative about him, but describing an Orwellian world. And the extraordinary thing about 1984 is it has two lives. It was published a few months before his death. It was published, I think, in June 1949 or July. He died in January. But they already knew it was going to be a great success. And subsequent to his death, I mean, but also what's cited in the OED, the Oxford Dictionary, Orwell was virtually the first person in an essay, a book review, or an essay, short essay that he wrote about the atomic bomb, where he used the term Cold War, and 1984. It's been said by Louis Menand correctly, I think, is the single most important cultural document in the Cold War. And the CIA paid for many translations. It's what Orwell would have thought. I mean, isn't it terrific that the book became better known, and subsidized publications of the book, and distributed the book, somewhat secretly or semi-secretly, distributed the book in Eastern Europe and so forth. So its first iteration was in the Cold War, and I think in those days Orwellian would have stood for being anti-communist, anti-Russia. Although Orwell had to assert that he was a figure of the left, because the book, particularly in the United States and the John Birch Society, was co-opted by the right. And there's no question that the book is deeply anti-communist, but Orwell never never advocated the overthrow of the Soviet Union, but he just didn't want Soviet communism to spread elsewhere. That's what he was against. But he never believed there should be a hot war with as far as I know, with Russia. But then the extraordinary thing that's happened now, thanks to Donald Trump and other causes, 1984 has never been selling better. Fake facts, alternate facts, And I think Orwellian, in its present iteration, means, and with AI and so forth, this has even become more prevalent. Orwellian has come to stand for the manipulation of the past, the manipulation of facts, and also we haven't quite gotten, although perhaps Zoom is an indication of that. We haven't quite gotten to telescreens, but the sense that the past can be rewritten via computers. That's one aspect of Orwellian, and the other aspect of Orwellian is that we can be supervised or investigated or found out about. Our privacy is violated, and so it's what's the word, omnipresence, or the power of computers and those who wish us harm. Oh, some who maybe want to sell us nice things, but on the whole, for business reasons and so forth. But that our interests and what we purchase, that we can be supervised or looked at. Our privacy is much in danger. And I think that sort of hovering presence, I think, is what is now construed as what we mean by Orwellian.
So I've finally got an opportunity to start 1984 after years and years of, I guess, putting it off. It starts with a wonderful line. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. So in your view, are we to expect the clocks to be striking 13 anytime soon?
But I hope not. And it's sort of unclear. I guess it's it's again the perversion of it's not quite. Why is it so horrible that they're striking 13? I think because we like to think of it as 1 p.m. I mean that's the traditional way of thinking about time. Although many airplanes and in many situations the 24-hour clock is used, and it doesn't seem so awful. But the implication, I guess, of the first line is that the state is decreeing that the 24-hour time should be universal. And it's the power of our rulers, or of deciding how everything should be, and the uniformity, etc.
So Orwell lived as a socialist when there were two particularly odious political movements that used or co-opted the name socialism. One is National Socialism, and the other is Soviet communism. So how did Orwell view these two movements as contrary to his own socialistic views?
Well, I mean, of course, National Socialism, the German system. He did write one sort of slightly appalling essay in which he said he couldn't. He did, although if he had the opportunity to assassinate Hitler, he would have taken advantage of it. But he didn't actually feel a sense of personal animosity to Hitler, which was slightly peculiar. I think I don't think he, as far as I know, I may be wrong. He never really discussed National Socialism. I mean, he was obviously against the Nazis. Although it has to, what's a bit unusual, Orwell was such a powerful writer that any position he took it seemed to be permanent. But in fact, he changed his mind a lot. And when he came back from Spain, there was a 2-year period from 1937 to 1939, where in fact he was a pacifist, and he felt that the British system and the German system weren't all that different, and he opposed going to war. But somehow, when the Russian, the Soviet Nazi pact came, he then felt that war was a good thing, and then he became a very powerful anti-fascist and anti-pacifist, and argued that if you were a pacifist, you in fact were supporting fascism. Um, Now, there's no question that he's a figure of the left, but he gradually, I mean, again, people tend to see Orwell changing very quickly, but in fact, he gradually became more and more, he didn't become a convinced socialist, as he wrote explicitly in a famous letter to Cyril Connolly. He didn't become an explicit socialist until towards the end of his experience in the Spanish Civil War. And as he wrote to Connolly, I now am which was a democratic socialist. Quite why he put that adjective, what he meant by it is a little unclear. A democratic socialist, comma, as I understand it. So, he could have a very nuanced view of socialism, but he became a convinced socialism, and he also a socialist, and he also argued during the Second World War, erroneously, that Britain would have to become a socialist state immediately in order to win the war. It is true the state became much more powerful, obviously, during the war, but it didn't become socialist, and then it became semi-socialist after the welfare state. But, I think he had a sort of standard definition of socialism, that the state should control more things, industries and things like that, that there should be much more egalitarian society. But it is in 1984, and also in his own thinking, his particular powerful contribution, which he wasn't necessarily totally original in it, but that that his emphasis upon it, I think, was very powerful and different, is the role of power. And the argument that he makes is that, and it wouldn't be true of it'd be true of any particularly of a socialist society, but maybe others, that the transformation of a society into a socialist society is a good thing, I think, from Orwell's point of view. But he said the only way that this can last in a good way, which of course is also the message of Animal Farm, is if there's a continual rotation of leaders. And he's cynical in a way about human nature with some justification. He says the people such as Lenin and so forth, and of course later Stalin, even worse, who lead the revolution, and that's good. But the only way the revolution is going to stay as a good thing is if the leaders are continually changed, because otherwise the leaders will fall in love. Knowing human nature, not surprisingly, will fall in love with power. And he says I've forgotten the exact date, but it's not very long after the 1917 and the Russian Revolution, when there's a mutiny at Kronstadt in the Russian, if I may have the details wrong, in the Russian Navy, saying the regime is getting too authoritarian, and it was crushed. And Orwell sees that as an indication that the leaders will behave extremely badly and in totalitarian ways in order to preserve power. So the love of power and keeping power undermines the revolution, and obviously that's what's happened in 1984. On the other hand, there's a rather obscure, somewhat debated note of hope in 1984. He says somewhere the hope belongs, hope believe, the proles may revolt, but also the rather sort of not very clear the appendix on Newspeak writes about the regime being in the past tense, and that somehow this terrible state of has been overthrown. Also, I think, well, it's not quite Orwellian, but another reason that 1984 has never been more read than it is now is how accurate it is about the current situation. That there are three great powers: the United States and the West, Russia, and China. And the war of Ukraine couldn't be a better example. That tragically, and these great powers, well, particularly Russia and the West, in 1984, where Eurasia, etc., the three great powers, and they're fighting each other by proxy. They're not directly fighting one another. And, the current situation where these wars are taking place, the most dramatic and tragic Ukraine, which in effect are the superpowers fighting each other by proxy. And Orwell seeing that as a likely development, it's not quite what Orwellian means. I think Orwellian means is now generally taken as signifying the power of computers to transform things, and it's Orwellian that the past can be changed, or the present, things can be manipulated by the power of computers, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I wonder how would George Orwell think of what or how the Ukraine war changed society in general, not just the West, but Russia too. I'm sure he'll be very.
Well, I actually don't like when and this was this happened a lot. Well, now quite a few years ago, at the time of the Vietnam War. Where the right tried to say Orwell would have supported the United States, and the left said Orwell would not have supported the United States. We don't know. I don't like, and it frequently comes up, what would Orwell say about X today? I don't think we really know. And I don't think it's a profitable line of inquiry. What I do think is important, though, is how what Orwell has taught us, what Orwell has written about the significance of language and the significance of power and the keeping of power, that the insights he had we can use to think about the present. And in a way, it's almost presumptuous. I mean, Orwell, it's amazing. I mean, Orwell is more than 70 years dead. And it's amazing that he's still such a present figure. And I think he's incredibly useful to think about language, to think about power, to use Orwellian ways of thinking, to think about present situations. But I almost think it's presumptuous and self-regarding on the people who do it to say, how will all, what would all have thought about a particular situation? And I think it's self-serving. I think people use it I'm going to use the mantle of Orwell to support my point of view. And I don't think that's the best use of his genius and accomplishments.
Yeah, I understand. So one of my favorite pieces of writing that Orwell has produced is Politics and the English Language.
Yes.
And of course, traces of uh, that essay can be found in both of his great novels, 1984 and Animal Farm. You have your War is Peace, Freedom is Slavery, Ignorance is Strength from Big Brother. And in Animal Farm, you have Everyone is Equal, but every animal is equal, but some animals are not equal.
No, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others.
Mhm. And
Yes.
since you bring up the topic about how language can be used to I guess project or influence power in a way, uh, should we be worried about that problem now?
Oh yes, I mean, of course. I think we always should be worried how language is used, and I mean, Trump makes these mostly erroneous and extravagant statements. But he's very clever in using language powerfully. Yes, language is a very important tool, and it influences people. So we have to be wary, careful about how it's used, and Orwell in Politics and the English Language and other essays, believed in simple, straightforward language. That fancy language was a way of obscuring things. Well, I mean, language is how we communicate.
But in 1984, Newspeak was invented as a way to reduce the amount of words needed to express things.
Yes. Yes, again, to prevent, to limit thinking, and of course, it's also ironic. I mean that he's contributed words to the language, newspeak, double plus, ungood, etc., etc. And again, it's slightly ironic in that people use these Orwellian words that in a way he was making fun of, but they use them as a shortcut to thinking. I think is possible.
So you wrote in the book that World War One really shaped the way Orwell thinks of uh, the world in general. And after the First World War, two of the great totalitarian movements sprung up: National Socialism and Soviet Communism. And of course, there's a dispute on whether the war caused those two movements to happen, like correlation, causation,
Well,
etc.
it obviously played an important role. Yes.
Mhm. So, in what ways did this First World War influence Orwell's thinking?
Well, what I argue obviously there's a vast Orwell literature, and these points have been made before, but I think what hasn't been paid sufficient attention to is the importance of the First World War and the Second World War in Orwell's thinking. And what I'm arguing in the little book is his patriotism has a lot to do with growing up just before. Well, he was born in 1903, so clearly he was very, very young. But that he was a schoolboy during the First World War. And sometimes he's characterized, I think, erroneously, as an outsider. He couldn't be more of an insider. Um, the family didn't have much money. Um, but it was descended from money. And of course, again, it's not particularly relevant to what we're talking about, but it's quite fascinating. And to me, is a wonderful example how current interests legitimately shape um, how we look at the past. The origins of Orwell's family money was slavery, in that his great great grandfather, Charles Blair, was a slave owner in Jamaica. And he married a daughter of an aristocrat, a daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland. Um, and he established the family as a wealthy upper class family. But the money got dissipated, and Orwell's grandfather, who was a vicar, an Anglican priest, had 10 children. I think Orwell's father was the youngest. So the money was virtually gone. But somehow in England, you can preserve your class position, even if you're short on money, through your descent. And his father was in the opium trade, was a British official who in India, where Orwell was born, involved with the legal cultivation of opium to be sold to China. So Orwell was very much in the official classes, and then he couldn't have had a more upper class. Well, his famous definition. He said, "I'm a member of the lower upper middle class," which means I'm a member of the upper middle class, but without money. And so he had the class position, and he got a scholarship, a semi-scholarship, half scholarship, to go to a boarding school at the age of 8, which was traditional among the British upper middle class and upper classes. And then he went to the most famous boarding school in England, Eton. And even by that time, he was becoming somewhat critical. He was a bit of a cynical adolescent, and he was becoming somewhat critical of the state. But these were the young men when they left school, when they left Eton. They would go become officers in the army, and were killed at a great rate in the First World War. So this growing up during the First World War, going to these institutions with his family background, made him, in my view, deeply patriotic. At the same time, he became increasingly critical, and he gradually, and again, it was gradual. I think people tried to see it as being sort of immediate and early. He gradually became more and more anti-imperialist and more of a socialist. But I don't know whether I may have wandered off from your original question.
Let's see. Yeah, not really, but you provided more than what I could ask for. So, final question on his socialist views. In 1946, a quintessential anti-socialist tract was published by an Austrian man, Friedrich von Hayek. It is titled "The Road to Serfdom," and in it, he basically argues that leading a certain state to a socialist direction would lead it to ruins. So I wonder if Orwell himself was aware of the text while he was alive, and if so, what would be his objections to it?
Well, I have a faint feeling he may have written about it, but I may be wrong. I mean, obviously, there's absolutely, which I thank in the book, magisterial 20 volumes edited by Peter Davison, who just recently sadly died, of Orwell. And there's a huge cumulative index in the last volume. and one could actually look up whether he says anything about Hayek. I have a feeling he was aware of him, but that's subject to correction. Um, but as I keep saying, I don't think Orwell would lead. Would say socialism is a bad thing. He just would say that I think he was a committed socialist. So I don't think he would say that socialism would lead to bad things. But socialism, that and this would be true of any regime, whatever its aims, are corrupted, can be corrupted by the people in charge doing anything in order to preserve power. I mean, he saw it really as not as an ideological issue, but as well, I don't know, what's the word? Sort of practical issue that human nature being what it is, people will do, the leaders will behave in horrible ways, killing people, etc., etc. Although 1984, is a rather the proles are are sort of ignored and can get on with their own world, sort of apolitical. So I think he's rather ambiguous, because there is the famous phrase in the book, the hope lies in the proles, and he associates it with the woman who's singing in the street. But actually, I mean, I think he's also slightly ironic or questioning it, because that moment of warmth about the proles, almost immediately afterwards, it's when it turns out the love nest is a trap, and the screen falls, the wall falls, and the screen comes, and Julia and Winston are arrested. But again, it's something that's just recently come up in some context or other. I can't quite remember. Orwell was a great admirer, well, as part of his patriotism, of the English working class, and I think that he felt, that they were decent, honest. And he tried to pretend that he had these things about how you should drink tea. There's a wonderful, in England everything can have class connotations, and whether you put milk in the tea before you pour the tea, which is the more working class way of doing it, or milk in the tea after you pour the tea, which is the more middle and upper class way of doing it. Or sometimes, according to Orwell, workers would put tea in the plate to cool it, and he tried to sort of ape at times, particularly when he was down and out, working class habits. But people would know he was an Etonian. People would say to him, he was an Etonian down on his luck. And sometimes, he put off when he arrived in Spain and went to see John McNair, who was the agent for the Independent Labour Party. And he said, I'm Eric Blair, and I want to write about Spain, and maybe I'm so excited about what's happening, I want to join a militia. And McNair, whom we interviewed, and he may have written this somewhere as well, said, who's this Etonian? He recognized that he had an Etonian, and he was put off by him. But then somehow Blair, McNair didn't at first realize that he was George Orwell. And when he discovered he was George Orwell, whose books he liked, then he was much more receptive. I don't know if you've read The Road to Wigan Pier, which is a very sort of paradoxical book in where he romanticizes the working class and is very nasty about middle class socialists. He sees these people on a bus, these men, with in shorts and sandals, and he says, "I'm sure they're vegetarian teetotalers." At the same time, what he doesn't tell you is that they and himself are going to a independent Labour Party conference in which he was going to speak. So in a way, although he didn't dress that way, and he wasn't a vegetarian or a teetotaler, but in a way, he was almost a sort of middle class socialist of the sort that he was making fun of.
Yes.
I probably wandered away from the original question.
Yes, and that is more than encouraged in this show. I have a particular resonance towards the road to Wigan Pier as
particular what? Excuse me, I'm missing what?
Resonance. Sorry, the word's resonance.
Resident.
Resonance.
Oh, resident. Yes.
Yes. So as in the road to Wigan Pier particularly resonated with me in that you can see traits of it in the present day in the, I guess, the current I would call it distance between the working class, particularly in Britain, and the upper class who are of the liberal progressive persuasion. For example, the working class Britons are more likely to vote for Britain's exit from Europe, and the upper class socialists are more likely to vote Remain, and also the working class of Britain, I imagine, do not share certain lifestyle habits as the upper class left of Britain. So, and I think George Orwell's satirical criticism really applies there. So, to Orwell, does that mean that true socialism can only be managed and governed by the working class?
No, I don't know whether I really can answer that question. Well, ideally, of course, it should be everybody. Whether, well, the famous remark that I quote a lot, I've quoted made by John Strachey, who was a very left-wing figure. In which he said that if Britain ever has a communist state, half of the cabinet would be old Etonians, and my cliche about this is not particularly Orwell, but my cliche about British history and the monarchy is a wonderful example. I don't know what Orwell thought about the monarchy in particular, but British society is incredibly capable, although has a lot of difficulties now. Incredibly capable of making radical change in order to stay as much the same as possible. Ernest Bevin, and Nye Bevin to a lesser degree, Ernest Bevin was the great trade union leader, who was the foreign secretary in the Attlee government after the Second World War. And, the working class, there wasn't really total male suffrage until 1918. And of course, there wasn't total female suffrage until I think 1928. No, I mean, I think it has to be some. Are you saying that it has to be run by the work? No, I mean, I would hope that all classes would participate. Um, well, there'll be a general election shortly, and everybody's saying now that Labour will win. But who knows? And Labour, of course, is not all that to the left. Although it was felt it was going too far to the left when what the Lib Dems were established. But I'm not really all that. I'm interested in the past and sort of current. Although my nephew, though we don't have a touch of English blood, but my sister married an Englishman, and her son is a fairly well-known British politician called Ed Vaizey. So I have some sense of what's going on in England, but I don't follow it sort of professionally, and so I really don't feel capable of predicting what will happen in the future. And I don't know how far. I don't think Britain's going to go more to the left. Well, there might be some nationalization, but I sort of doubt it. Um, no, Mrs. Thatcher sort of dismantled, to a degree, the welfare state. But the National Health Service, which has, a lot of people complain about it with good reason, but nevertheless, I don't know what's the situation in Austria. The United States is so far behind in terms of medical services. I think Britain will continue to degree to be a welfare state, but how militant the working class is, and what the power is now of unions. As I say, I really don't have any special knowledge about the present situation, but obviously the working class ideally would be deeply involved in any changes that took place. And Orwell had almost a great sort of sentimental proclivity to like the working class. I think he somehow thought that they were more genuine and had the right instincts. He romanced somewhat to a degree. Well, as you probably remember, in The Road to Wigan Pier, he has this ideal picture of a working class family, sort of sitting around the fire. So but he also saw, and anyway, it's also a demonstration of his skill as a writer, and quite why it makes a difference. There's a famous scene in The Road to Wigan Pier, which somehow stands for the working class being oppressed, although it's not quite clear how that works psychologically. Where he says, and he puts himself at a distance. The famous scene where he describes a woman poking up a drain, and he says he saw it from a train, but in fact that's not true. Somehow we know that he was walking past and he saw her, but somehow he thought aesthetically to make it something he saw from a train. Made it. It's unclear why that's true, but I think it is true. Made that more dramatic. There's this very month. There's a new expanded biography of Orwell by D.J. Taylor, whose earlier biography, published I think in 2003, is excellent. But now there's going to be an expanded version of it being published right now.
Well. Yeah, I really should check that one out. Moving on to the topic of patriotism, George Orwell participated in the Spanish Civil War, where he fought for the Republican cause. So what I find it to be interesting is that it is obviously a civil war. That means the two sides are fighting for a different vision of Spain, and I can presume that there is patriotism distributed on both sides as well. So for Orwell, the is for Orwell, is it possible to be patriotic when, say, a country of your own um, goes to a different political direction than you had in mind, or than your ideals?
Oh yes, you're patriotic about. You're not patriotic because of the particular regime. I mean, you don't switch off patriotism because you don't like the current government. Um, I mean, through much of Orwell's life, except for the last 5 years when there was a Labour government, most of his life, except for brief Labour governments, very brief Labour governments, the Tories were in power. I don't think that made him less patriotic. So I mean, I don't think your affection for your country. I mean, I didn't feel anti-American when Trump was in power. uh, so I have many anti things that I think are wrong in the country. And I don't think I'm a deep patriot, I wouldn't consider living in another country. Well, that's where I've had my career and so forth. So I don't think patriotism is tied in with if even if one deeply disapproves and would love to overthrow, even by revolution possibly, overthrow obviously Orwell didn't want Franco to be the ruler of Spain. I don't know. Well, Orwell obviously, became, but of course, the most famous moment, one of the most famous moments in Spain, is when he shakes the hand of the Italian militiaman, and so I think he was very impressed by the international support that the loyalist side got in Spain, we received in Spain. And I don't think he had very much to do with Spain. Well, I may be wrong. Obviously disapproved of Franco. He wrote reviews of the books by Arturo Barria. And of course, he wrote a lot about, he wrote Homage to Catalonia. And then he wrote a terrific essay looking back on the Spanish War. Obviously, as I say, it was his participation in the Spanish Civil War that committed him to socialism. But I don't think he became a close follower of political developments in Spain, although obviously disapproved of Franco.
Yes. How would Orwell differentiate between patriotism and nationalism?
Well, he's very specific about that. And actually, he has a very clear differentiation, a rather charming one, I think. Patriotism to him means that you believe your country is the best in the world. But you don't have any interest in saying other countries should be like you. Mm-hmm. Nationalism says that your country is the best in the world and every other country should be the same. And it's obviously much more aggressive. And I think, as I've mentioned before, was frequently begotten. If Orwell had been a nationalist, he would have said we should try and destroy the Soviet state, that the Soviet state should not continue to exist. He explicitly says he has no interest in doing that. And I think let the Russians, benighted as they are in supporting this state, or let the Soviet state continue. And actually, this is also indicative of his attitude towards imperialism, because again, it's somewhat ambiguous. He didn't think well of how can we put it? He was enough of a traditional Englishman, I think, in his heart of hearts, or maybe explicitly, he felt that the British would rule Burma better than the Burmese could. But he also came to firmly believe that the British had no business doing that, and Burma should be ruled by the Burmese. And, I think the situation maybe I think I'm maybe going too far. I mean, and I can't follow the intricacies I don't quite understand what's going on in the Sudan. But certainly, the warfares and the regimes in Africa have many problems, and you could, I don't know whether I would agree, but even if you say for a moment, if these countries were ruled by France or Britain, they would be better off, even if you thought that might be true. Orwell will never say this shouldn't happen. It's totally unacceptable that one country should rule another country, even though they might be able to do a better job at ruling the country.
So, final question. So Winston Smith from 1984 wrote in his diary, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Now, on the surface of it, it is the definition of freedom as Orwell or Winston sees it is kind of contradictory in that you are free to say that 2 + 2 is 4, and you are not allowed, or you shouldn't be coerced into saying that it equals 5. But at the same time, the answer to 2 + 2 is there's only one true answer to it, and that being 4. So you technically do not have the freedom to say that it is anything other than 4. And since we touched on the topic of misinformation in the Trump era, the freedom of speech means the freedom to spread misinformation, but there's only one truth. So how would Orwell reconcile these two propositions?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand. And it was also the origin of it. Some people have argued, was the Russian 5-year plan, where there was great emphasis to complete it in 4 years, and that might have been why 2 + 2 = 5. I think it stands for the power of the state, of a state, to force you to say something that's untrue, that is untrue, but nevertheless, in order to conform, in order to be in good and not get into trouble, and not be tortured. After all, it's when he's tortured with the rats, which Orwell had a phobia about. Well, with some justification, but the power of the state to force you to say so, and to somehow internalize it, that something that was obviously untrue is true. That the state can order you what to do, and I think that's what that stands for, and the state to say make statements that in their heart of hearts they they actually know are untrue, but it's the assertion of the state's power.
Mhm. So what I find to be remarkable about 1984 is that Winston is not a conventional hero. He does not triumph over the system. In fact, he succumbed to it in a very gruesome manner. So should we all, I guess, see ourselves in Winston Smith when we're living in a hypothetical totalitarian regime wherein you're much more likely to succumb to the state's whim rather than be a hero? And
Well, yes, well, I think we should all try. And there's this book by what's his name, which actually not very is sort of disappointing. And also, what hasn't been discussed very much, although people are obviously very aware of it, is his name, and Winston. To any reader, particularly British readers, but other readers as well, conjures up Winston Churchill.
yes.
And Smith conjures up every man. So Winston Smith is sort of a combination of hero, potential hero in resisting the state, although Winston Churchill, and we don't really know quite what Orwell. Well, I think he admired, but actually during the war, he felt that Winston Churchill should be dismissed. But I think ultimately he recognized that he was crucial in the war effort. So it's this combination of hero and everyman that Winston Smith, I think, stands for. And also, I don't know if some years ago, where Simon Sharma did this TV series and book, which I wrote about a bit, the history of England, and the last episode in it is called "The Two Winstons," which is about Winston Churchill and Orwell. So I think the name is significant, but one has to speculate about why Orwell chose to call him Winston, because he's not, as far as I know, he's not explicit. But Winston would automatically, in a reader's, particularly when the book was published. When actually he was published, Churchill was still prime minister. No, I'm sorry. He was going to come back, I think, after being dismissed in 1945, losing the election. But when did he come back? And I think just after Orwell's death, he came back as a prime minister. Again, I think I'm not quite sure I've answered your question.
Yes, and I think you answered it, and even more so, as usual. So on that note, thank you very much, Professor Peter Stansky of Stanford University, for being on this program.
And so what happens? Do you do this weekly, or what?
Right now, 3 times a week.
3 times a week.
Yes. Yes.
And about how many? Do you know how many listeners you have?
A good amount, but the number of regular listeners are in the 200-ish.
Well, I hope you'll urge them, if I may say so. It's not too self-serving. And of course, presumably well, you don't know where your listeners are, but it would be nice if they were interested in purchasing the little book.
Of course.
I could actually send you a flyer about it, which if you order it from the Stanford Press, you can get a 20% discount. It's very short, but it's also not very expensive. But it may be awkward to order from abroad. I don't know. I'll send you the flyer. And I mean, it would be nice if more people bought the book.
I'll link it in the show notes. The book is obviously The Socialist Patriot, George
Yeah.
Orwell and the War.
That's right.
Okay,
well, how did you decide to be in touch with me? How did you become aware of the book?
There was a review that I read that pointed me to your direction.
Well, it hasn't been received very many reviews. Was it in Foreign Affairs?
National Review, to be more specific.
The American National Review?
Yeah, the magazine founded by William F. Buckley Jr. That one.
It has a review of the book?
Yes, it was in a previous edition, and I'll be happy to send it your
Oh,
way.
send it to me. I'd be very curious because presumably they favor the right wing or they want to co-opt Orwell for the right or not. I'll be very curious what they say. Yes, I didn't know about that. I'd love to see it.
Okay.
So I'll be present it to me.
Okay, I'll send it to you. So until then, take very good care of yourself.
Well, good to talk, and thank you for interviewing me.